Hello again. It is generally accepted that the more often a falsehood is repeated and drummed into people, then the more likely it becomes that those hearing it will absorb it and eventually come to believe it to be true. So it is with being told over and over again that race is merely a social construct and that there are no real and measurable differences between the members of various ethnic groups. Surely, if this were not true, then so many famous television personalities, authors, and politicians would not be able to keep saying it over and over again. Here, for instance, is Ali Ratanzi, a professor of sociology in London and the author of a book on racism, which was published by the Oxford University Press, called Racism, a Very Short Introduction. I give a link to it in the description to this video. He announces in the introduction that most sociologists in the UK and many in the USA are now convinced by scientific research that race is a social construct rather than a biological fact. This is often reflected in the use of quotation marks around race by many sociologists, and indeed I often follow this practice here and in other writings. Well, that is fairly definite, and I dare say that most viewers have heard and read similarly dogmatic statements, where the idea of race as a social construct is presented bluntly as an almost universally accepted truth. No more debate needed. Now, it may well be true that most sociologists and probably most left wing politicians and people working for the BBC and the Guardian newspaper do believe this. But that does not make it so. A few pages later, Ratanzi, quoted above, began by talking of the heartening unanimity among sociologists on the subject of race being a social construct, but then he makes an admission. Sociologists, of course, are bound to see everything in terms of social structure. Perhaps they're not the best people to consult if we want to know about biological matters, such as the possible subdivisions within a species. We might be better off asking what biologists and anthropologists or geneticists think about this kind of thing. There, as Ratanzi himself says, the story is very different. He says, for the USA, significant interview and textual research conducted by anthropologist Anne Morning suggests that not only are a great many academic anthropologists and biologists still adhering to a biologically essentialist concept of race, but this is also common among her sample of American undergraduates taking anthropology and biology courses. Essentialism denotes the view that members of a group share one or more defining characteristics which are innate and unalterable. A survey of popularly used biology and anthropology textbooks in US schools also demonstrates there is a widespread tendency to use a biological concept of race rather than presenting students with the idea of race as a social construct. Let me translate all this into plain English for viewers. What it amounts to is that non-scientists, that is to say sociologists like Ratanzi, constantly assert that race is an illusion, while actual scientists, that is to say biologists, geneticists and so on, say that there is a difference between races, inherent differences. Which position you take in the debate depends on whether you wish to follow the scientific evidence or prefer to allow your views to be shaped by ideology. History contains many examples of what happens when ideology overrules science, uh, whether in Nazi Germany or Soviet Russia, but in the long run it always ends badly. For my own part, I would rather listen to scientists rather than sociologists.